We know that fast food and ultra-processed foods have negative health consequences for humans. There's no debating that. A lot of the time, seed oils are going to be components of those ultra-processed foods. However, we have to start to pull apart what is actually causing the issue there. And if you just look at seed oils themselves and take them outside of ultra-processed foods, they themselves do not cause the issue. If you replace saturated fats with these seed oils, you see reductions in rates of cardiovascular disease, reductions in all-cause mortality, reductions in LDL ApoB levels. We get beneficial health outcomes.
The great Mary Pardee. What's happening?
How are you? It's good to see you.
Excited for your and Skylar's retreat, which is around the corner.
Me too. I'm really looking forward. The last one we did was so fun. It was just like I left the weekend being like, wow, that was a retreat for myself. So I'm excited.
Yeah, and for people who are not aware, my better three quarters, Skylar, Dr. Mary, are leading regular retreats up at our retreat center in Topanga. They're kind of female longevity retreats
hmm
broadly. Skylar brings the movement, Mary brings the science. It's like
hmm
chocolate and peanut butter. This time, I believe, if I am correct, you have wrangled a DEXA van.
We got a full Dexavan coming up to do body compositions, and then I am going to be helping people read those and interpret them. And so we're gonna do a couple other things like that too. We got a couple surprises, but I'm really excited for it.
Yeah, it's great. I've gone to the DEXA van a couple times,
hmm
and I can mostly, I think, read the results, but I might need your help somewhere down the line.
Happy to, happy to. Yeah, most people say don't get in a random van, but we're gonna do it this time.
Yeah, a white windowless van
Yeah,
on Sunset
exactly.
Boulevard.
Exactly.
That's exactly what I told my daughters not to do. Okay, we're not here to talk about that. We're talking about seed oils. That's why we're here, because this is a topic pinging around the Serengeti of social media, and it's hard to know exactly where to stand. I've actually said some things publicly that have been critical of seed oils that I might have to reevaluate. I don't know. A couple weeks ago, I pinged you because I know that you're always game to do the research and to pull apart the clinical trials and studies and give me a fair assessment. So that's what we're here to do. Thank
Of
you for agreeing to
course.
do that.
One of my favorite things to do is really question the narratives on social media.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's just start very big and broad. So when people say seed oils, what exactly do they mean? What are these seed oils, and how do they differ from like olive oils or animal fats in fatty acid profile?
Yeah. So when we talk about seed oils, we're usually referring to vegetable oils extracted from seeds versus the meat of a fruit. So that the meat of the fruit would be like olive oil, avocado oil, palm, coconut oil. So we're looking at extracting from the seed, and we're looking at polyunsaturated fatty acids or PUFAs. And specifically, we're really talking about linoleic acid, which is an omega-6 fatty acid. Examples are going to be like your soybean oil, corn oil, safflower oil, sunflower oil, cottonseed oil.
These are processed oils, right? And so in some ways, they inherent negative rap on them within some communities that are really looking to kind of appeal to nature, or looking for foods that occur naturally in the natural world, I guess you should say. But these are processed in that sense. Do you feel that the seed oils sort of initially took on a bad reputation because people were conflating them with partially hydrogenated oils and trans fats, et cetera, that we eventually found out to be really detrimental to health, particularly to cardiovascular health?
Yeah, potentially. And I also want to say that there's linoleic acid in a lot of things that are not processed as well. So like
Mm.
chicken is a huge source of linoleic acid. You'll have salad dressings, which those are going to be more of the processed oils that we see there. Nuts and seeds are going to have these omega-6 seed oils as well. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding around seed oils. And I think a lot of it gets back to the mechanistic side of things, where if you ever have taken a biochemistry course, you probably remember the chart that the teacher shows where if you have two different oils, so if you have linoleic omega-6 fatty acids on the left, it goes down and starts to transform, and you end up with arachidonic acid. And on the
Mhm.
right-hand side, usually of that graph is going to be an omega-3. So it's going to be alpha linolenic acid and goes down and forms EPA and DHA. And usually at some point, the teacher goes, an arachidonic acid is pro inflammatory, and then you have your anti inflammatory omega 3s. This kind of concept was somebody took it and ran with it to demonize linoleic acid as an inflammatory seed oil. But when we actually look at the research, we don't see that it causes inflammation in humans when you look at the randomized control trials.
Okay, because that is, I think, a primary message that we get on social media. And candidly, I've been guilty of saying that
Yeah.
probably in a podcast because I've been just influenced by what I hear. Essentially, omega 6 or linoleic acid is pro inflammatory, and omega 3s are anti inflammatory. And the ratio between those are really screwed up in terms of how we eat. That seems to be a message that we hear out there. But what you're saying is that's not really borne out by the data.
Exactly. So in science, you have a few different steps that you go through. And the first one is a hypothesis. So it would make sense to have a hypothesis of, do these omega 6s, linoleic acid, increase inflammation because of this whole cascade that leads to arachidonic acid? But then when you have a hypothesis, you have to follow it up with an actual randomized control trial. And we've done that. So we have that information and we have to use that data. We can't just use the mechanism anymore because we now know that that hypothesis did not stand up. They don't cause inflammation in the human body.
What about the related myth that using seed oils, particularly like in a fast food context, where seed oils, get reheated over and over and over again, and they get oxidized because of that process. And then that oxidation of those oils can downstream lead to kind of oxidative stress, inflammation, et cetera. Is there data to support that hypothesis?
So we know that fast food and ultra processed foods have negative health consequences for humans. So there's no debating that. A lot of the time, seed oils are going to be components of those fast food, ultra processed foods. However, we have to start to pull apart what is actually causing the issue there. And if you just look at seed oils themselves and take them outside of ultra processed foods, they themselves do not cause the issue. And in fact, if you replace saturated fats with these seed oils, you see reductions in rates of cardiovascular disease, reductions in all cause mortality, reductions in LDL ApoB levels. And so when we're replacing, we're taking out saturated fat and we're putting in the seed oils, we get beneficial health outcomes. Now, nobody in their right mind, I hope, is suggesting eat more fast food or ultra processed foods. That is not
Mhm.
the message
Mhm.
that's going on here. But what we do want to say is don't be replacing, because you see this wave of movement with like carnivore, and you're seeing a bunch of restaurants now using like tallow instead of seed oils, right? And we
Mhm.
know from the research that that's not a good decision for your health.
What about the actual process of making seed oils? And this is not something that my knowledge is super sharp on, but I know that there's certain solvents that are used. I think hexane is one that gets thrown around in the actual processing of the seed oils themselves that people often point their finger to as detrimental to health. Do you have any insight there?
With anything like this, it's dose makes the poison. That's with water, that's with exercise, that's also with hexane. And so hexane is really efficient at actually pulling and extracting out the seed oils from the seed. So it works really well in that. There's a limit in terms of toxicity, but the FDA put the limit. I think it's at less than 1 part per million is considered to be safe. And if you test commercially available oils, The average is between zero point 0.2 and zero point 0.6 parts per million, so it's below the safety standard that's there. Toxicology studies have shown that if you are going to get sick from hexane used in seed oils, you would need to consume hundreds of liters of oil per day to get to harmful levels. And at that
Mm.
point, you got other issues, including diarrhea.
I can always count on you for a diarrhea comment. So, I mean, why did we make seed oils in the first place? I mean, was this just for shelf stability of processed foods, or what was the motivation for this?
And that's a great. I don't know the history too much, but my guess is when you refine a seed oil, what happens is you extend the shelf life, so it becomes the substance that can hang out a lot longer. You're also going to be removing some of the things that can change the flavor of the oil too, so it becomes more neutral kind of flavoring. And then there's some negatives, so you're going to remove some of the antioxidants when you're refining a seed oil, and that's just kind of par for the course. When you get one benefit, you're exchanging something else. Do you know the history? I'm not sure. I'm guessing it was just for shelf stability.
There were certainly these kind of partially hydrogenated oils. I think they came about, I don't know, maybe in the 50s.
Mhm.
Again, this is a little bit of guesswork. As we started to see more ultra processed foods come into the fore and become more common, where I see the history of seed oil sort of getting tainted is that people started to conflate these partially hydrogenated oils with trans fats, essentially. And trans fats, there was a lot of data, even in the early 90s, that trans fats would contribute to cardiovascular disease. And, it took, the FDA 30 years basically to wipe, to make initial warnings. And now partially hydrogenated oils and trans fats are prohibited in foods. They kept granting these big food companies extensions and extensions and extensions. And I think that built a lot of distrust around these oils. And then there was this sort of conflation, particularly because, as I understand it, seed oils that don't have a high smoke point, quote unquote, can get oxidized. And then that oxidation can lead to sort of downstream negative impacts for health. That's kind of a little bit of a layman's understanding of where we came to, or where seed oils came from.
Yeah, so I think it's important to separate, which I think is what you were saying, but we have seed oils, right? Most of them are refined, they're liquid at room temperature. And then we have trans fats or partially hydrogenated oils. And
Hmm.
you could use seed oils to make trans fats, right? By hydrogenating them partially, which is just the addition of a hydrogen group to that carbon. And so you're taking out a double bond and you're making this like semi solid. When we fully hydrogenate something like that, it becomes a saturated fat. So we're talking about, when we talk about trans fats, are partially hydrogenated oils. They're just two different things, though. So we
Yeah.
want to make sure that we are not speaking about them as the same, which is the point that you're trying to make. But we know for sure at this point, that's why they're banned, that trans fats increase LDL cholesterol, increase triglycerides, increase CRP, inflammatory markers, increase the risk for cardiovascular disease, sudden death from cardiac causes, diabetes. It's like a 23% increased risk for coronary heart disease. So yeah, we don't want those.
Mhm. And I think a lot of the seed oils, if I understand it correctly, are now these what are known as high oleic seed oils. So they've been bred to essentially have very, very high smoke points, so they don't oxidize as easily. And I think sunflower oil and kind of high oleic safflower oil fall into that category. When you cook at home, what would you recommend people use in terms of sautéing or frying?
It depends on what temperature you're cooking at, but that can be like a use case for those high oleic oils where when you have a high oleic oil, you're going to have a lower percentage of linoleic acid, and a
Mhm.
higher percentage of mono unsaturated fatty acids in there, which is the oleic acid. That's why it's high oleic.
Mm.
And doing that increases the smoke point of the oil, so it makes it more stable at higher temperatures. And so if you are doing high heat cooking, if you're frying things, then that might be a better option there. But if you're just using like a salad dressing, no need for that. And that may be a better case for some of the seed oils to be implemented because of the research. And so it just depends on the temperature that you're cooking and the use case for each of these. But that's where, like you said, the highlight comes.
What about just pure caloric intake? So I think a lot of people meet seed oils in their relationship with Doritos or chips or fries, other packaged snacks, etc. I'm assuming that seed oils have the same caloric content as normal fat, so like 9 calories per gram, right? But
Mhm.
there can be probably a significant concentration of these oils in a bag of chips. Maybe pull that apart a little bit, where we find seed oils mostly, and is it really, is maybe the most detrimental aspect of them the high calorie content?
I figured out a stat in preparing here where it's 55% of US calories come from ultra processed foods, which is
Mm,
a
yeah.
lot. And that's not where we want to be getting our calories from. We ideally want a whole foods diet, rich in fruits and vegetables, lean proteins, healthy fats, making sure that that is the basis of the diet when we are making decisions based on, do we want to use coconut oil? Do we want to use tallow? Do we want to use butter? Or do we want to use these seed oils? That's where you want to make the decision of, we're going to use the seed oils if you want lower rates of cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. And
Hmm.
so it's not about, oh, make sure you get your Doritos in to get as much linoleic acid as you
Yeah.
can. Like, that's not the conversation here. But when you're making those swaps and you're making the decisions, you don't have to avoid seed oils. And in fact, we should be choosing the product with the seed oil over the saturated. Linoleic acid is an essential fatty acid. So it is essential. We don't make it in the body. You have to consume it. You can get deficiencies of linoleic acid, which are really rare because of how we consume things and how abundant these things are in our diet. But it's interesting to think about who might be at risk for linoleic acid deficiency. And, I was thinking about different kind of diet groups and people who are eating carnivore and they're strictly eating like ruminant animals. So they're just doing beef and they're excluding chicken, they're excluding pork, they're excluding eggs, they're not doing nuts and seeds and things like that. Those people are actually potentially at risk for a linoleic acid deficiency. And the symptoms of that are going to be like scaly skin, rashes. You can get hair loss, brittle nails as well. And again, very rare if you're eating just like a well balanced diet. But now we have these people who are doing these dietary extremes. And those are actually people where you might want to be like, wow, we should actually do a diet log and make sure you're getting enough linoleic acid in the diet. It's about 10 to 15 grams per day for the, adequate intake.
That whole ratio argument between omega-6 and omega-3, is that just largely mythology?
It's largely mythology. I was working in a research lab before I went back to naturopathic medical school, and they were in the nutrition department there was actually talking about the ratio. So this isn't like something that's just social media. It's been talked about in the research. And what we believe at this point is that absolute levels of omega-3s, absolute levels of omega-6 matter more than the ratio that's there. So the ratio is an artificial number, right? We're deciding to compare one versus the other. And the issue with a ratio is that you can improve a ratio by reducing something or
Mm.
increasing something, right? And we don't want to just play around with the numbers. We want to make sure we're getting adequate amounts of both omega-6 and omega-3s. The vast majority of people aren't getting enough omega-3s in the diet and they're getting enough omega-6s. What we wouldn't want to do is, oh, just eat less omega-6 and that'll improve your ratio, when the real issue is you need to get more omega-3s in the diet.
Where would be the best place to get omega-3s? Yes, you can supplement, but I'm specifically talking about it exogenously in diet.
Yeah, and we actually see from nutrition research that it is much more beneficial to get omega-3s from the diet than from like a fish oil supplement. So I tell all my patients there's not great research for a fish oil. There's much better research if you can eat fish twice per week at least. And you can also get it from things like walnuts, nuts and seeds are going to have omega-3s, chia seeds, things like that. Going to be much denser in your cold water fish than the other things. So salmon, trout, sardines, all of those fish that are really high in those omega-3s are great sources. And in practice, I do an omega-3 index on my patients just to see where they're at. Twice a week is not optimal for everybody. Sometimes people need to eat it a little bit more. And we can look at that in the blood and go from there.
There are a couple outlier studies that suggest harm from adding linoleic acid. I think there was this Australian, the Sydney Heart study that had some suggestion that demonstrated some cardiovascular risk to excess omega sixes. Are you familiar with that study? And what's the problem with that analysis, if there is one? And are there other studies that you look to that show this cardiovascular benefit of substituting omega sixes for saturated?
This is a really important point because if you're listening to the other side that omega, that these seed oils are bad for your health, this is a lot of the stuff that they're going to bring in. And so there was 2 studies that potentially show other things beyond what I've been saying on this podcast. So the Sydney Diet Heart Study was in the 1960s, 1970s. It was like 500 people. I think that they were all men, and it was secondary prevention. So they had already had a heart attack or a coronary event. So those people weren't healthy, right? They had already had established cardiovascular disease, and it was a randomized controlled trial, and they were putting people onto intervention groups that replace saturated fats with safflower oil, but they also used a trans fat. So they also used partially hydrogenated oils there too, because it's the 1960s. And they lumped those together. So that's part of the issue with that study. And it's similarly, the other study that you're talking about, the Minnesota coronary experiment, also had a treatment group that they used margarines with in addition to these seed oils. The study designs are not by far not perfect in these 2 studies, and we may be seeing some of the issues with trans fats coming into the results of these studies. Not only that, but there's going to be other issues with these 2 studies. So both of them, people weren't healthy. So both of them were sick populations. Minnesota Heart, I think, was in a some sort of psychiatric institutionalized population. And then we also have issues with power in both of these studies. And power in research is basically saying, do you have what you need to be able to say with certainty your conclusions? Do you have enough people in the study to actually make this conclusion? Did you have enough events actually occur in the study to make these conclusions? And both of these studies were underpowered to actually make the conclusions that they made. In the Minnesota study, you had like a 75% dropout rate. And when they re-examined and looked at the actual data, a lot of the data was missing or not fully filled out. So in general, 2 not great studies. But what I would say, which is the next stage, is it's actually okay that these aren't 2 great studies because we have a bunch of other studies and we can do a meta-analysis of the studies that we have. That's where you get to like the 2020 Cochrane Review, which was 15 randomized controlled trials. So you're looking at 56,000 plus people and at least 24 months of data for each of these studies or longer. So making sure that they were long enough to actually have the results be valid. And what they found in that Cochrane Review was a 17% reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. American Heart Association similarly concluded that replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats like seed oils lowers cardiovascular disease risk by 30% according to the randomized controlled trials. And so just because there's 2 studies that are like kind of thing, we want to look at meta-analysis above single studies all the time. What you don't want to do is you don't want to cherry pick a couple of studies and say, here, look at this. It's like, okay, yes, there's some issues here and here, but what if we pull all of it together and see what all of that says? And that's really where the power of a meta-analysis comes in, is that you can make conclusions much more, have a lot more weight when you take a lot more people into consideration. And then
Hmm.
we have other types of studies that we see as well. So you have prospective cohort studies, which are observational studies, and you're basically following people and either basing it on, okay, we're going to test their levels in the blood, which has been done, or we're going to base it on what they tell us they were eating. And we have both of those different types of studies where people actually measured how much linoleic acid is in the blood. And when you measure, you see that higher levels of linoleic acid in the blood show lower rates of type 2 diabetes, lower all cause mortality, lower cardiovascular disease mortality, and even lower cancer mortality. And similar stuff when you're asking people what they eat, it correlates really similarly in terms of lower cardiovascular disease, diabetes, all cause mortality.
Yeah, that was one of the questions I was going to ask because I've got to imagine it's pretty difficult to run your gold standard controlled studies because the adherence to diet is so difficult. And so, primarily, are these studies either kind of observational, self-reporting, et cetera, or and then, as you mentioned, kind of taking serum blood levels to measure linoleic acid? Is that primarily how these studies are done?
Not the Cochrane Review studies that I'm talking about. So the Cochrane
Yeah.
Review ones are actually randomized controlled trials where people were put into a treatment group where it substituted saturated fat. They put in seed oils in replacement of those saturated fats versus saturated fat kind of control group. So they're two different things here, but the Cochrane Review is looking at 15 randomized controlled trials.
So what does this say about carnivore diets or, diets that are heavy in saturated fat consumption?
That's one thing that I feel really good about at this point, is to say that, like, if you want to reduce your risk for cardiovascular disease, having a diet lower in saturated fat is probably, with a good amount of certainty, a good idea. Carnivore diets typically are going to have higher saturated fat. I guess they don't have to if you like, I don't,
If you have like lean game.
super lean game,
Yeah. Yeah.
and maybe you're still including fruit in it, kind of thing. I really believe from the nutritional sciences that a well-balanced diet that has a bunch of different things, including plant-based proteins, including fruits, including vegetables, including lean protein, and not adding saturated fat. So, I see things on social media where I'm like, "Oh, please." Like young people, like, adding butter to their steak intentionally because it's helping, cure their PCOS, and I think we just have to be really careful here, because if you go on an ultra restrictive diet, whether it's carnivore, whether it is Atkins, whether it's low carb, whether it's a fruitarian, whether it's vegan, the first thing that's usually going to happen is you're going to lose weight. And so if you were overweight to begin with and you had PCOS that was partly being exacerbated by being overweight, then weight loss is going to help. And what we don't want to draw the conclusion of is, oh, it's adding butter to my steak that's helping my health, versus it was the weight loss that led to the improvements. And maybe I should try to attain the same level of weight loss, but include fruits, vegetables, and not have a ton of saturated fat that I'm adding to my diet. And so
Mhm.
this is like association versus causation 101.
Are there any other trends that you are witnessing, particularly on social media, that you might want to take this occasion to count on? The savannah of social media is awash in trends. So I want to give you that opportunity to comment on anything.
There's a million and one trends. I do want to talk about, do we talk about the CRP data? Because I think
Oh,
that's
no,
one
let's
thing
do
that,
that. Yeah,
let's do
let's
that
do that.
first. The main thing that people will say, like I said, is like the biochemistry, right? In terms of it leading down to arachidonic acid, and that's pro-inflammatory and great in terms of hypothesis. And then, oh, we actually have randomized controlled trials. So there was a systematic review of 15 randomized controlled trials that was done, and they found that increasing linoleic acid, same as seed oil, did not increase inflammatory markers. So they looked at CRP, IL-6, TNF alpha, fibrinogen, different cytokines, and across the board, when you replace saturated fat with seed oils like linoleic acid, you do not see increases in inflammatory markers. And so, like, hopefully that can kind of lay that to rest.
Mhm.
And that's why we have trials to look at, is that we can answer these questions.
What else are you seeing out there on social media that has you scratching your chin a little bit?
I literally just saw a clip about somebody saying that they found the cure. There was one cure, and it was the same cure for inflammatory bowel disease, Alzheimer's disease, all these things that we don't have cures for. And somebody sent it to me on social media and go, "What do you think?" And I just want to like, I want to pull my hair out when I see things like that because, first of all, like when you hear something like that, that we now have the cure for all of these things that we don't have the cure for, and it's on social media versus like on the news by like somebody with some more significance, but it's preying on really vulnerable populations, and that's what makes me so angry. It's like there's somebody out there whose mother, whose father has Alzheimer's disease, and you're hooking them in with that, thinking that you're gonna give them the solution to save their parents. And I really hope whoever is making this content can really sit with that and say, like, is that your best self showing up to relay this information? And are you actually doing what you were meant to do on this planet? You can see I could go on a rage fest right now. But I just think
Well,
it's not okay to do to people. And we don't have the cure for Alzheimer's disease. That's total BS.
one of the tricky pieces of it is that, science and particularly medical science is very nuanced. It's very complicated, yet, it is often consolidated into, socially optimized 90-second
Mhm.
blurbs. And, it does draw people in. And I will raise my hand and say, like, hey, I'm guilty of this because it's very easy to kind of like fixate on this concept of like, yes, inflammation is bad. It sits upstream from a lot of chronic disease. That could be absolutely true. And linoleic acid and is omega-6, and omega-6 is pro-inflammatory. Hence, avoid omega-6, avoid seed oils because that will lead to inflammation. That is like, I almost said it in 90 seconds,
Yeah.
but that is something that you can get your head around as a layman. And I consider myself a layman. In a way, it's like curiosity and interest in human biology and human physiology that we've seen, particularly, since COVID, is really great. We want people to learn more about biology and biochemistry, except social media is just not a great sandbox for it.
Totally. I think you hit the nail on the head. And I get it because I've been there too. I consider myself when I was in my 20s and stuff, like just kind of naive. Like people would say things and I'd be like, people don't lie. Like that's got to be true kind of thing. And the more that you actually dig into it yourself and realize that, people unfortunately they just simplify things. And I think most people are just well intentioned, but it's a game of telephone. It just keeps getting passed on, and it's easy and it makes sense, and so it sticks kind of thing. Yeah, we gotta start to question the narratives and go with the science. That's my belief as well.
So what else is Dr. Mary Pardee working on these days? What is stoking your curiosity and your passion?
I am loving and have always loved just one-on-one patient care. So I think about like what lights me up on a daily basis and working with people one-on-one to transform their health, whether it's to help them lose weight or to just get stronger or to reduce their risk for cardiovascular disease or to help them with their GI issues. That's what stokes me right now. I'm working on a couple other projects as well, and I'm always on social media at some level ish. Yeah, that's what I got going on.
And so how do people come and see you if they're so inclined?
People who live in California, or who are willing to travel to California in person in Beverly Hills, I do telemedicine as well. And so my website is modernmed.com. There's no E in modern, modrnmed.com. And you can schedule a complimentary meet and greet with me, see what I do, see if you have a urge to work with me, if you want to live a longer, stronger, happier life. And I would love to talk to you.
And Skylar tells me your pull-up game is on.
Well, we should do pull-ups at the retreat. Yeah. Yeah, strength.
Yeah.
If you actually want like research, like really science-based things in terms of longevity, exercise is number one. Like we can make
Yeah.
it so simple, but and I try to practice what I preach.
Well, thank you, Mary. I know that this upcoming retreat with Skylar is sold through,
Yeah.
which is awesome that there's so much interest, and so we'll have to get a few more on the books
Yeah. I think we're
to
gonna do
meet.
one in the spring or something, so there'll
Yeah,
be more to come. Absolutely.
yeah, we got to meet the demand.
Yeah. Thanks.
Well, thank you as always for your measured and well-researched content. I deeply appreciate it, as many people do.
Thanks
So
for having
great.
me on and actually having like a platform to share this information too, because I think it's going to help some people.
You got it. Okay. Think of some more topics.
I will.
All right.
Absolutely.
All right. To be continued then.